Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. We'll be again continuing to look at the Civil War, and this is video 3. So, as we dive in further, we're going to kind of begin to look at the roles that we see from women. We're going to look at the roles also of prison camps as well as field hospitals in the Civil War. Then we're going to kind of wrap up this video talking a little bit about some of the political and economic changes that are starting to occur in the North and the South as the war continues to wage. We'll get more into some more of the battles in our fourth and final video, then our fifth and final video, in which we're kind of starting to highlight the latter part, the turning points, as well as the end of this American Civil War. So those are our learning objectives for today. We're going to talk about the role that women play, prison camps, as well as field hospitals, and then we'll get into the political and economic changes that are occurring in the North and the South as the war continues to wage. So the image that we started with, we're going to continue with here, is the Union soldier in a family in 1861, so right at the beginning of the war. And one thing that we should note about the war is that it impacts different parts of the country differently. Since a lot of this war is being fought in the South, in the Confederacy, a lot of the war had a greater impact on the daily life of Southerners as opposed to those in the North. Now, certainly taxation, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the political changes that you'll see in the North, but the biggest impact of the war, certainly on everyday life anyway, was on Southerners. And so we've kind of recapped some of these early battles. We talked about the Monitor and the Merrimack. We talked about certainly Bull Run. We even talked about the Second Battle of Bull Run. We got into Shiloh and Antietam. And we will be kind of transitioning here in a little bit towards the latter years and the turning points. So turning points, certainly we'll get to Gettysburg and we'll talk about the importance that played. And then, of course, places like Vicksburg as well, and Chattanooga. But we will get into that more in future videos. And then, of course, when we look at the final battles, of course, we're looking at, famous battles like the Siege of Atlanta and the taking and Sherman's March to the Sea and Savannah and getting into Bentonville and Wilmington. And then, of course, we can't forget, Appomattox Courthouse, where things officially end. And, of course, Cold Harbor and even the Battle of the Wilderness or Petersburg's siege. So we're definitely talking about a different way of life. Schools oftentimes were closed, as well as churches, and sometimes these schools were used along with the churches as hospitals in order to tend for the wounded. So Southerners who lived in the path of the marching armies, oftentimes they lost crops, sometimes they even lost their homes due to the fighting. And so one of the things that you certainly start to see as an impact of the Civil War, especially in the South, is that shortages of food and supplies were very common. And even some household and commonplace items started to become very scarce in the South and in the Confederacy. And so you're definitely starting to see how the Civil War and the strategy of the blockade and the Anaconda Plan is going to start to have its effects on everyday life, especially in the South. Now, we can't talk about the Civil War, of course, without talking about the contribution of women. Women played a variety of different roles that they had not before. Keep in mind that a lot of the men, and we'll talk about the draft here in a little bit, when they went off to war, women had to pick up the slack. And so they took on tasks of keeping the farms and working in factories and running offices. And so they started to get a taste of the life of a little bit more non-traditional for the time period jobs. And so certainly they kept the economy running. And of course, we'll see this in the future, certainly in time periods like World War II, where women are going to become invaluable to the war effort. Many women also entered into the medical profession to help heal the wounded. And we should note the contributions of Mary Edward Walker. She became the first woman Army surgeon, and she did surgeries on the battlefield. She was eventually awarded the Medal of Honor 1865 at the end of the war for her bravery while serving on the battlefield. She, so far, is the only woman to have this honor bestowed upon her. This is also the first time that women also were serving, and we're talking about thousands of women serving as nurses. So certainly we've got people like Clara Barton, Dorothea Dix, Sally Tompkins, all helping to establish women in the medical field during the Civil War. And certainly people like Clara Barton going on to help found things like the Red Cross, and certainly helping to establish the occupation that we now know as nursing. And to help, I should say, help to newly define it. We also had women serving as spies, Rose O'Neill Greenhow, certainly, Belle Boyd, and of course, you know this third one, Harriet Tubman, all serving as spies in the war. And women served as spies for both sides, both for the Confederacy as well for the Union. You even had some women who would disguise themselves as men in order to become soldiers. Quite famously, Frances Clayton served in the 4th Missouri Artillery as part of the Army. So you had women fighting in the war itself. Let's transition to prison camps and to field hospitals. So when Americans, of course, went to war, most were not prepared for the horrors of the war. And so, especially during the first parts of the war, the first years of the war, many of the captured were given parole and were allowed to leave after being captured. Later on, many of those parolees were returning to the battle, and the sides would conduct prisoner exchanges. And during the last years of the war, prison camps began to be set up both in the Union and the Confederacy in order to prevent captured soldiers from returning to battle. So trying to eliminate some of the advantages and disadvantages. So as you look at the map, you can see there's certainly some Union camps in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, as well as even in Maryland and New York. And then you can see some other ones for the Confederacy in Virginia and the Carolinas, Georgia, as well as Alabama. And it should be noted that the conditions in these camps were very harsh, and volunteers often distributed very little in the amount of subsistence, so bread and soup. So conditions were quite horrific for people who were in these prison camps. And probably the most notorious of these prison camps is in Georgia. It's in Andersonville. And so located here in southern Georgia. We have to bring up Henry Wirz. Henry Wirz is going to be the only person in the Civil War who's going to be charged with war crimes. He's the one who's in charge of Andersonville. In fact, some of the horrors that you would have seen here would have been people like literally starving to death and suffering from malnutrition, and essentially, in some cases, quite literally wasting away. He's later going to be executed, and his defense before he dies is Wirz claims that he was just following orders and that he's being killed for doing what he was supposed to do in following those orders. And certainly you could see there's some comparisons here to the Nuremberg trials, and we'll get into that more when we get to World War II. So certainly as we get to the turning more to the field hospitals, on the field of battle, it was very common for surgeons to be working amongst gunfire in order to save the wounded. So they literally waded into the battles and were trying to serve the wounded as best they could. Conditions everywhere for soldiers, even before fighting began, were quite unsanitary, and quite a few regiments lost, in some cases half of their men to illness before a battle even began. And in the Civil War, a soldier was twice as likely to die of a disease than a battle wound. And so, as the medical technology and the medical practices in nursing and for surgery begin to improve, we're going to start to see some changes towards the end of the war. But as we looked at it, all this horror made it very likely, or made it likely for soldiers, of course, to suffer from PTSD, but also about, and we've mentioned this already, but about 1 in 11 Union soldiers, as well as 1 in 8, ultimately deserted and ran away as part of their fear of the war. Looking at a little bit of technology too, certainly the rifled cannon was able to have a range of up to 5 miles. And part of that is certainly the barrel and the rifling components of this. But you can see in the interior, and this is also true of muskets for the time period, you can see more of that swirl. So when we look at the mini balls and the new calibers of bullets, this is part of the reason why the Civil War is so deadly. And we've talked about this a little bit already, but the technology here is so much more lethal, but the tactics haven't caught up. And that's part of the reason why, like at Antietam, other battles, we have such a high cost. And so I'm just going to show you guys some examples and pictures here of some of the different calibers as well as the mini balls. And of course, we've got the rifled percussion musket, which again, along with the Spencer repeating carbine rifle, were two very popular weapons that were used during the Civil War. If you haven't checked this out, this is from the series America, the Story of Us. So I'm not going to put it on YouTube, but it talks a little bit about the effects of a cannonball on the human body. So I highly encourage you to check that out. And of course, it was very uncommon for surgeries to be done, as well as amputations. And so you're looking at some of the medical equipment that was used in order to address those needs. All right, in this last little part of the video, I want to talk a little bit about some of those political and economic changes. So with these shortages of food, you are going to see results in things like bread riots throughout the South. And you're also starting to see a political change in the North, in which some Northerners were kind of becoming more weary of the fighting, and they were calling for the reuniting of the states, but they wanted to do it through negotiation instead of war. And this group became known as the Copperheads. And in many ways, they were challenging the fighting of the Civil War and that attempt at trying to bring the Union back together through negotiations. And as a kind of a way of dealing with war opponents, both Lincoln and Jefferson Davis both had a strategy of suspending habeas corpus. So what does that mean? Habeas corpus is a legal order for an inquiry to determine whether a person has been lawfully imprisoned. So essentially, both in the Confederacy as well as the Union, you could be charged with a crime. Now remember, part of your right is to know, as part of the Bill of Rights, is that you have the right to understand what you're being charged with. You have the right to a speedy trial. But when habeas corpus is suspended, you don't have those rights. And so some people can be thrown in jail, not be charged with a crime, and sit there as long as the government chooses to keep them there. And this was done a lot with war spies on both sides, so they couldn't pass on information. So you're looking at a political cartoon here of the Copperhead Party, again, trying to proceed with peace, but doing so through negotiation as opposed to ending the war and trying to perhaps smooth over some of the new strategy of making the war about slavery. So the other part of this is having enough soldiers. So the Confederate Army drafts a new law, or they put in a new draft law, which requires basically any able man between the ages of 18 and 35 to serve in the Army for a minimum of 3 years. And draft is essentially the selection of a person for military service. And certainly in the United States, we still have a draft or have the select service, but we haven't used it in a while. The challenging part of the draft, though, is that you could hire somebody to be a substitute fight for you. So essentially, the quote that makes its way around throughout the Confederacy, but also certainly in the Union a little bit later, is that this was a rich man's war, but poor man's fight. In other words, rich men were the ones conducting the war and pushing for the war, but it was the poor men that had to do the fighting. The North also tried to offer a bounty, which was money given as a reward to encourage enlistment into the Army, to encourage volunteers, and eventually they also passed a draft law. And because of this discrepancy, there was also riots that broke out, most famously in New York City, over this feeling that the draft favored the rich. And the last thing I want to talk about is the economic change. So both sides were hit very hard economically. This war was very costly monetarily, along with its human costs. But the North overall was better able to deal with the enormous cost of the war because of their greater resources. And so they were able to use those resources in order to keep funding the war. The North eventually printed money that they called greenbacks because of their color. And the North, in their industry, and again, that was a major advantage they had at the beginning of the war, were able to produce more guns, ammunition, shoes, and uniforms than the Confederacy was. And as a result, both sides dealt with inflation. And again, inflation is that continual rise of prices of goods and services. It occurred on both sides because goods were in such high demand. But when we look at the inflation rates, the North was 87%. South was 9,000. So the inflation rate in the Confederacy is astronomically high. And Confederate money is becoming more and more worthless. So why did the Confederacy experience such overwhelming amount of inflation? What's the story here? So there's a few things going on here. The blockade of those southern ports is working. Remember, we talked about 2/3 of the trade early on in the war being cut off. And so it's becoming more and more challenging to sell goods, make money doing so. And as the war goes along, more and more farmland is being destroyed. So that means less and less crops being produced. It means less money for people, and it also certainly means that goods are going to become more expensive in order to bring them in or to produce them, even within the South or within the Confederacy. There's also that lack of industry to produce manufactured goods, so more of it had to be brought in from outside if it could get through the blockade. And you're also seeing the number of escaping slaves starting to strain the economy in the South. And so with more and more slaves escaping in the North after the Emancipation Proclamation, you're really going to see that this is going to start to have some massive effects on the Confederacy. So that's where we're going to wrap up today's video. Thanks for listening. To my students, make sure that you've been following along with the guided notes. And for those of you who are listening, I appreciate and I hope that we're helping you to gain some understanding of how the Civil War happens and why it ends the way it does. Thank you for listening and have a great day.